11 years ago, my husband looked me in the eyes, 7 months pregnant, and told me our baby would ruin the life he had worked so hard to build. He packed 2 suitcases that night and never looked back. Last month, he knocked on my door, thinner than I remembered, his hands trembling in a way I had never once seen from a man who used to hold a scalpel over someone's open chest without flinching, and he said 4 words I never expected to hear again as long as I lived. Your son can save me. I didn't know yet that those 5 syllables would unravel a secret he had buried for over a decade, a secret that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with fear. Stay with me until the end, because what he was really asking me for wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous to give. And by the time this story is over, you'll understand why the truth almost destroyed us both a second time. If this pulls you in the way I think it will, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, tap the like, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that walking away from someone doesn't mean you've walked away from the consequences of it. My name is Renata Ashford. Before any of this happened, I lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Charleston, teaching biology at the same public high school I'd graduated from myself. I wasn't chasing money or status. I liked chalk dust on my fingers, lesson plans color-coded in 3 different highlighters, and the particular kind of tired that comes from actually caring about the work you do every single day. My husband, Julian Ashford, was the opposite kind of tired. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, the kind of doctor whose name got dropped at dinner parties like currency, the kind of man strangers assumed had his entire life figured out simply because of the letters after his name. We met in college, long before the white coat and the reputation, back when he was just a nervous pre-med student who used to sit beside me in the library because, in his words, I made him feel like a normal person again after a full day of organic chemistry. I loved that version of him. I never quite got used to the version that came later. As Julian's career climbed, something in him shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. The late nights at the hospital stopped feeling like sacrifice and started feeling like escape. He talked about his patients more than he talked to me. He corrected small details of my stories at dinner parties, gentle little corrections in front of colleagues that were never really about accuracy. They were about reminding the room and reminding me who the smarter one in the marriage was supposed to be. I told myself every marriage moves through seasons. I told myself surgeons carry a weight most people can't imagine, and that weight has to settle somewhere. I made excuses for him the way you make excuses for weather. You don't get angry at a storm, you simply wait for it to pass. Looking back now, I think some part of me already sensed something was wrong long before I had the language to name it. There was a night, maybe 8 months before I got pregnant, when Julian came home late from a conference and mentioned, almost in passing, a researcher named Dr. Priscilla Vane, a woman doing groundbreaking work on inherited cardiac conditions. He said her name the way some people say the name of a place they're planning to move to. I remember that flicker of unease and dismissing it immediately, because surely a man who had just spent an hour describing someone else's brilliance in vivid detail couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong. Surely admiration and betrayal look nothing alike. I was wrong about that too. When I found out I was pregnant, I genuinely believed it would soften him. For a few weeks, it did. He came home early twice that month, which for Julian felt like a small miracle. He put his hand on my stomach exactly once, and I remember thinking, this is the moment we finally get him back. This is the thing that fixes everything the last 2 years slowly wore away. But something shifted after my 20-week appointment. The obstetrician mentioned a minor complication in my blood work, something the doctor described as manageable, something that simply meant closer monitoring and a bit more caution moving forward. Julian went quiet in the car. He stared out the window the entire ride home, and when I asked what was wrong, he said he was just thinking about a difficult case at the hospital. I believed him, because why wouldn't I? 2 weeks later, he told me he had been offered a position at a prestigious cardiac center in Atlanta, a position that came bundled with the chance to work directly under Dr. Priscilla Vane, the same researcher whose name he'd said so carefully all those months earlier. I didn't think much of the excitement in his voice at the time. I should have. The night he left, I remember every detail with a clarity that almost feels cruel now, the way certain moments burn themselves permanently into memory while entire years blur together. It was raining lightly that evening, the kind of rain that doesn't soak you so much as cling to your skin in a fine mist. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom with 2 suitcases already packed and waiting by the front door, as if he had rehearsed this exact staging for days while I was folding tiny onesies down the hall in the nursery we had just finished painting. He said the words slowly, deliberately, like a man reciting lines he had practiced in front of a mirror more than once. He said a baby, especially one with even minor complications, would slow him down at exactly the moment his career finally had momentum. He said Priscilla understood ambition in a way he claimed I never could. He said he was sorry, but it was the kind of sorry you offer for stepping on someone's foot in a crowded elevator, not the kind of sorry that acknowledges you've just stepped directly on someone's heart. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I remember standing very still, one hand pressed against the doorframe for support, the other resting protectively over my stomach, feeling my son kick for the very first time that exact night, as if he already somehow understood his father was choosing to disappear before he had even chosen to properly exist. Julian left for Atlanta 3 days later. He sent a lawyer instead of a goodbye phone call. The divorce was finalized 4 months before my son was born, and Julian never once asked to be present in the delivery room. He didn't ask what name we had chosen. He didn't ask whether he'd had a son or a daughter. For 11 long years, that particular silence remained the loudest sound in my entire life, louder than any argument we'd ever had while still married. I named my son Theo. Theo Ashford, though I seriously considered changing his last name more times than I'd like to admit out loud. Being a single mother on a public school teacher's salary wasn't easy, but it was honest, and honest felt like an unexpected luxury after years spent living with a man who measured his own worth by how impressive he sounded across a dinner table. I picked up weekend tutoring jobs. I learned to fix a leaking kitchen faucet from a grainy video instead of calling anyone for help. I sat up some nights doing math in my head, stretching a single paycheck across 2 weeks of groceries, gas, and a growing boy's shoe sizes. There was one particular winter, Theo was maybe 5, when our old furnace broke down completely, and I genuinely didn't know if I could afford the repair without falling behind on rent. A neighbor, a retired plumber named Mr. Holloway, fixed it for the cost of parts alone and waved off my attempt to pay him more, saying only that he'd raised 3 kids on his own once too, and he remembered exactly what that particular kind of fear felt like. Moments like that taught me something Julian never could have, that real family sometimes has nothing to do with blood at all. Theo grew into a curious, gentle boy who asked more thoughtful questions about the stars than most adults ask about their own lives. He never asked much about his father. Kids have a strange, almost instinctive way of sensing which doors are better left unopened. Occasionally, usually around his birthday, I would catch him staring a little too long at other fathers picking up their kids from school, and something in his small shoulders would sag just slightly before he caught himself and straightened back up again. I never pointed it out. I simply held his hand a little tighter on those particular days. There was one afternoon in 3rd grade I still think about often. Theo came home with a family tree assignment, a simple worksheet with branching lines waiting to be filled in with names. He sat at the kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes staring at the empty box labeled father, his pencil hovering above the paper without ever touching it. I offered to help him write Julian's name in, just to finish the assignment, but Theo shook his head and quietly wrote Grandpa instead, referring to my own father, who had stepped into that role without ever once being asked to. He handed the worksheet in the next morning without a single complaint. I found out from his teacher months later that Theo had actually turned it in a full week early, as if getting it out of his hands as quickly as possible somehow made the empty space hurt a little less. I never told Julian about that particular afternoon. Some wounds, I decided, belonged only to the people who lived through them. Over the years, I heard fragments about Julian's life the way you hear distant thunder from a storm that has already moved past you. He married Priscilla Vane roughly 2 years after our divorce was finalized. They co-authored medical papers together, presented at conferences side by side, built the exact glossy professional life he had always seemed to want more than anything else. Occasionally a colleague of a colleague would mention his name at some school function, and I would feel a small, strange flicker of something, not longing exactly, more like the dull recognition you feel touching an old scar on your own skin. Life kept moving forward regardless. I built a small, sturdy, honest world for Theo and myself, one where love came, without conditions attached, and nobody disappeared the moment things became complicated. I genuinely believed that particular chapter of my life had closed permanently behind me. I was wrong about that too. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring when the doorbell rang. Theo was at basketball practice, and I was grading a stack of biology essays at the kitchen table with the television murmuring quietly in the background. I remember feeling mildly annoyed at the interruption before I had even reached the door, already composing a polite excuse for whatever solicitor was standing on my porch. Whatever irritation I felt evaporated instantly the moment I saw exactly who was standing there instead. Julian looked nothing like the confident, sharply dressed man who had walked out of our marriage 11 years earlier. He had lost weight in a way that didn't look intentional at all, the kind of weight loss that worries you even in a total stranger. His skin carried a faint grayish undertone I recognized from years of watching health documentaries curled up on the couch with Theo, the kind of color that makes you instinctively concerned without immediately understanding why. His hands, the same steady hands that had once performed delicate open heart surgeries on strangers, trembled slightly at his sides, like he was cold despite the mild spring evening. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us said a single word. Then he spoke, and his voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never once heard from him, not even during the very worst arguments of our entire marriage. He said he was sorry to show up completely unannounced. He said he wouldn't have come at all if he had any other option left in the world. Then he asked quietly if he could come inside just for a few minutes, just long enough to explain something important he needed me to understand. Every rational instinct I had told me to close the door firmly and go back to grading essays. Curiosity, and something quieter I couldn't quite name yet, told me to listen instead. I let him sit at the same kitchen table where I used to fold Theo's impossibly tiny clothes 11 years earlier, while my husband packed suitcases in the next room. He looked around the house slowly, taking in the photographs lining the hallway wall behind him, most of them Theo at various ages, none of them including him at all. His eyes lingered a beat too long on a photo of Theo's 10th birthday, and something flickered across his expression, though I honestly couldn't tell if it was regret or simply distant curiosity. He finally spoke, choosing each word the way surgeons choose their instruments, carefully, deliberately, methodically. He told me he had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a rare and aggressive form of bone marrow failure, a condition that had, in a cruelly ironic twist, been the exact subject of research he himself had contributed to years earlier as a young resident. He explained, in the same clinical language he always defaulted to whenever emotions ran too dangerously high, that his body had stopped producing enough healthy blood cells on its own, and that without a successful transplant, his own doctors had given him less than a year to live. I sat there processing the information the way you process a distant weather report, distantly, almost academically, right up until he said the one sentence that completely changed the shape of the entire conversation. He said the specialists had already run genetic panels on every relative they could possibly locate, his siblings, several cousins, even his own elderly mother, and none of them had come back as compatible donors. Then he said, quietly, almost reluctantly, that there was one person left they hadn't yet tested. Someone who, according to the geneticists' early projections, carried a statistically strong probability of being a genuine match. My stomach tightened before he had even fully said the name out loud. He said Theo. I felt something cold settle deep in my chest, a strange mixture of fierce protectiveness and complete disbelief. I asked him, my voice sharper than I intended, exactly how he thought he could walk back into our lives after 11 full years of complete silence and ask something like this of an 11-year-old boy who barely recognized his own father's face outside of a few old photographs. Julian's eyes filled with something that looked almost like genuine shame, though I had learned a very long time ago not to trust whatever emotion happened to cross his face in any given moment. He said he understood completely if I said no. He said he wouldn't blame me even a little. But then he added something that made the entire room feel suddenly smaller, colder, almost like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen closer. He said there was something else I needed to know first, something about why Theo's compatibility mattered so much more than ordinary family genetics alone would ever explain. I asked him what exactly he meant by that. He hesitated for a long, uncomfortable moment, his usual surgeon's composure cracking visibly at the edges, and then he told me something that made the floor beneath me feel like it was slowly tilting sideways. He said that during the original round of prenatal testing 11 years earlier, back when I was pregnant and the obstetrician had flagged that minor complication in my own blood work, there had been a separate anomaly quietly noted in his blood panel as well, one the fertility specialist had recorded privately in his personal chart at the time. He said doctors had suspected even back then that he likely carried a rare genetic marker linked to certain blood disorders, the exact same marker now confirmed present in his current diagnosis. He said he had known, or at the very least strongly suspected, for over a decade that any biological child of his would carry a higher than average risk of eventually developing a related condition, and that this specific knowledge, more than ambition, more than Priscilla, more than any glamorous career opportunity in Atlanta, was the real underlying reason he had panicked and left before Theo was even born. I sat completely still, staring at a man I had once believed I understood completely, slowly realizing I had spent 11 years building an entire narrative around simple cruelty when the truth, apparently, was something far messier and more tangled. He hadn't left because a baby would supposedly slow down his rising career. He had left, according to this new version, because he was genuinely terrified of watching a child of his own suffer from something he might have unknowingly passed down, and instead of facing that fear like a grown adult, he had run from it entirely and dressed his own cowardice up as ambition. For 11 years, I had told myself a fairly simple story about a selfish man chasing prestige. Now I was being handed a very different story, one about a frightened man who chose total abandonment over basic vulnerability, and I genuinely didn't yet know which version deserved more of my anger. Julian must have noticed the shift in my expression, because he pressed further, his voice quieter now, almost pleading in a tone I had never once heard from him in nearly a decade together. He said the doctors believed Theo, despite carrying the genetic risk, might have inherited a different, notably stronger variant from my side of the family entirely, one that could make him not merely compatible, but an unusually strong potential match. He said that without at least testing Theo, without simply knowing for certain, he had genuinely no other realistic options left. Every single specialist he had consulted, every clinic across 3 different states, had told him precisely the same discouraging thing. Time, unlike almost everything else in Julian's life, was the one resource surgery had never been able to buy him more of. I asked him the question that had been slowly building in my throat since the moment he sat down. I asked whether he had told Priscilla any of this, whether his wife of 9 years actually knew the real reason their entire marriage had quietly begun with a devastating lie buried underneath what looked, from the outside, like nothing more than an exciting career opportunity. His silence answered the question before his actual words ever did. He finally admitted, very quietly, that Priscilla knew about the illness itself, but not about the timeline and certainly not about the fact that his supposed decade-long fear of passing down a genetic condition actually predated their relationship entirely. In her mind, Julian was simply a devoted husband facing an unexpected and cruel medical crisis. In reality, he was a man who had spent over a decade quietly running from a truth he was only now forced to finally confront because his own body had run completely out of places left to hide it. Before Julian left my kitchen that first night, he mentioned one more thing, almost as an afterthought, though I would later realize nothing about that conversation had been an accident. He said Priscilla didn't yet know he had come to my house, and he asked, quietly, if I could keep that particular detail between us for now, at least until he found the right moment to tell her himself. I remember studying his face for a long moment, searching for the old arrogance I remembered so clearly from our marriage, but finding only exhaustion instead. I told him I wasn't in the business of keeping his secrets anymore, that if Priscilla asked me directly, I would tell her the truth. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he already knew was coming, and let himself out into the rain. That night, after Julian finally left, I sat on the edge of Theo's bed long after he had fallen asleep, watching the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, thinking about every single birthday party his father had missed, every school science fair, every scraped knee that had healed years ago without so much as a phone call from Atlanta. I thought about 11 years of complete silence, about the child support checks that arrived exactly on time every single month and never a single day early, almost as if punctuality had become Julian's own quiet way of proving he still maintained some fragment of control over something in our lives. I thought about how easy it would be to protect Theo from all of it, to simply say no and close that particular door permanently, letting Julian finally face the consequences of the life he himself had chosen 11 years earlier. But I also thought about a future version of Theo, years and years from now, somehow learning the full truth on his own, and asking me directly why I never once gave him the chance to decide for himself. The next few weeks became a blur of specialist appointments, hushed conversations conducted in parking lots so Theo wouldn't accidentally overhear anything, and long, sleepless nights where I replayed Julian's confession over and over, quietly searching for the small pieces that still refused to fully add up. Something about his version of the story kept nagging at me, a small inconsistency. I couldn't quite place it first, until one evening I finally worked up the nerve to call the fertility clinic we had both used together 11 years earlier, the very same clinic Julian claimed had first flagged his genetic marker all those years ago. The woman on the phone, after carefully verifying my identity through our old case file numbers, told me something that made my blood run genuinely cold. She said their records showed absolutely no genetic anomaly ever flagged in Julian's file from that specific time period at all. In fact, according to their records, the only flag on file from that year had been placed quietly in mine. I sat there with the phone still pressed against my ear long after the call had already ended, staring blankly at the kitchen wall, replaying every single version of the story Julian had told me across those last few weeks. If the original anomaly had actually been found in my blood work rather than his, then his entire explanation, his supposed decade-long fear of passing down a hidden condition, had been nothing more than a fabrication carefully layered on top of an already devastating truth. He hadn't left 11 years ago to protect Theo from some genetic risk that traced directly back to himself. He had left, exactly as I'd always believed, simply because he panicked at the idea of a complicated, demanding newborn slowing down his rapidly rising career. Despite everything, the underlying medical reality hadn't changed one bit. Julian was still dying. His illness didn't care in the slightest about the lies wrapped carefully around his diagnosis. And somewhere in the middle of my own justified anger, I had to find a way to separate the man who had hurt me so deeply from the desperate, deeply flawed human being now asking for a genuine chance at survival, a chance that ultimately had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with basic human decency. I made an appointment with a genetic counselor of my own, not for Julian's sake at all, but purely to understand exactly what a bone marrow donation would actually mean for an 11-year-old boy, medically, physically, and emotionally. Before I ever made that appointment, I spent a full sleepless night making a list on a legal pad, splitting the page into 2 columns, reasons to say yes and reasons to say no, the way I used to help my students organize an argument for a debate assignment. Under no, I wrote things like, he doesn't deserve access to Theo's body just because he's finally scared, and letting him back in even a little sets a precedent I can't undo. Under yes, I wrote a single line and stared at it for a long time before finally underlining it twice. A child is dying either way if we do nothing, and it just happens to be the one who left, not the one who stayed. I didn't make my decision that night, but rereading that legal pad days later reminded me that this was never really about Julian's redemption at all. It was about who Theo and I wanted to be, when the decision was finally ours to make. The counselor explained patiently that modern donation procedures for children Theo's age were far less invasive than the outdated, frightening image most people still carried in their minds, more comparable to an extended blood draw than any of the surgical horror stories passed down from decades earlier. She walked me through the risks honestly and thoroughly, but also made very clear that with proper medical supervision, the procedure carried a genuinely strong safety profile for young, healthy donors like Theo. Still, she reminded me gently of something I already knew deep in my bones. This particular decision, at its very core, belonged entirely to Theo himself, not to Julian, and honestly, not entirely to me either. That weekend, I sat Theo down at the very same kitchen table where his father had confessed his desperation weeks earlier. I told him, in careful, age-appropriate language, that his father was extremely sick and that doctors believed Theo might genuinely be able to help him. I watched my son's face closely, bracing myself for confusion, quiet anger, or the kind of withdrawn silence children sometimes retreat into when the adult world becomes too heavy too quickly. Instead, Theo asked a question that caught me completely off guard. He asked whether helping his father meant he was required to forgive him too, or whether he was allowed to help him and still be permitted to feel genuinely angry about everything his father had missed. I told him, honestly, that both of those things were absolutely allowed to exist together at the same time, that real kindness never required erasing the truth of what someone had actually done to you. Theo decided, entirely on his own, that he wanted to be tested. Not out of any deep longing for a father he barely remembered, but because, in his own careful words, being the kind of person who helped someone, even someone who once hurt you badly, felt more important to him than being the kind of person who holds on to anger simply to punish them back. 11 years old, and somehow he already understood something Julian had spent his entire adult life running away from. The testing confirmed exactly what the specialists had quietly hoped for. Theo was, in fact, a strong genetic match, notably stronger than most ordinary biological matches typically are. The procedure was scheduled at a hospital nearly 2 hours from home, and I sat alone in the waiting room during Theo's donation, staring blankly at the ceiling tiles, thinking about how strange it was that the very same boy Julian had once quietly called an inconvenience was now, quite literally, holding his father's entire survival steady in his own small, remarkably calm hands. The night before the actual transplant, everything nearly fell apart completely. A routine pre-surgical scan flagged an unexpected complication in Julian's chest, a small area of concern near his heart that the surgical team hadn't accounted for, and for almost 6 agonizing hours, the transplant itself took place 3 days later. I wasn't in the room, but Priscilla was, and later she told me something that stayed with me long after that particular conversation had ended. She said that in the final moments before Julian was wheeled into surgery, visibly frightened in a way she had genuinely never once witnessed from a man who had spent his entire career calmly slicing open other people's chests without so much as a raised pulse, he had whispered something quietly under his breath, not really to her, but almost to himself. He said he hoped Theo would grow up to be absolutely nothing like him. In the first 48 hours after the transplant, Julian's white blood cell counts stayed dangerously low, and his medical team warned us there was still a real chance his body might reject the very cells meant to save it. I remember sitting in that same hospital, this time in a different waiting room, holding Theo's hand while he flipped anxiously through the same magazine 3 separate times without reading a single page, both of us pretending we weren't listening for footsteps down the hallway. On the 3rd morning, a nurse finally came out with a first blood count update, and for the first time since any of this began, I watched something in Theo's small shoulders loosen with genuine relief rather than quiet resignation. The numbers were rising. Slowly, but they were rising. Julian's recovery afterward was slow but steady. His doctors were cautiously optimistic that Theo's donation had given him a genuine, realistic chance at full remission. I won't pretend this story ends with some tidy, movie-perfect reconciliation, with Julian suddenly transformed overnight into the devoted father he had never once actually been. Genuine healing simply doesn't work that way, and neither does trust once it's already been thoroughly broken twice. What changed instead was smaller, quieter, but in some strange ways, more meaningful than any grand gesture could have been. Julian began sending letters, not the cold, punctual child support checks he'd mailed for 11 straight years, but actual handwritten letters, addressed directly to Theo, filled with clumsy, Awkward attempts at building some kind of relationship 11 years too late to ever feel entirely natural. Theo reads some of those letters. He quietly ignores others, folding them unopened into a shoebox in his closet. I've told him repeatedly, and I meant every single word of it, that he owes his father absolutely nothing beyond what he's already generously given, and that any relationship moving forward from here is entirely his own choice to build, slowly, or to simply walk away from completely. As for me, I finally allowed myself to feel something I had actively avoided for well over a decade, a complicated, imperfect kind of peace that didn't require Julian's redemption in order to exist on its own terms. I stopped waiting for an apology substantial enough to somehow erase 11 years of silence, because I finally understood that some people are only capable of facing their own mistakes when survival itself forces their hand, and that kind of forced accountability, while still genuinely valuable in its own limited way, is simply not the same thing as authentic, freely chosen change. I built my life around honesty long before Julian ever showed up desperate and trembling on my porch that spring evening, and I fully intend to keep building it that exact same way long after his letters eventually stop arriving altogether. If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, above everything else, it's that the people who hurt us most deeply don't always come back seeking forgiveness. Sometimes they come back seeking nothing more than survival, and it's entirely up to the rest of us to decide exactly where the line exists between genuine compassion and complete self-erasure. I chose to let my son make his own decision about kindness, on his own terms, in his own time. I chose to protect the truth even when a far more comfortable lie was quietly being offered to me instead. And I chose, finally, after 11 long years, to stop measuring my own worth by whether Julian ever fully understood everything he had so carelessly walked away from. Real strength, I've learned, was never about punishing him for what he did. It was about refusing to let his choices continue defining the rest of my story, or my son's, one single day longer than they already had. A year later, Theo turned 12, and we celebrated with a small backyard gathering, just the two of us, Mr. Holloway from down the street and my parents. Near the end of the evening, Theo disappeared into his room for a few minutes and came back holding the shoebox where he kept Julian's unopened letters. Without a word, he sat down at the picnic table, opened one, and read it quietly to himself while the rest of us pretended not to notice. When he finished, he folded it carefully back along its original creases and told me, simply, that he thought he might write back someday, not yet, but someday, when he felt ready and not a moment before. I told him that sounded exactly right, and that there was no clock counting down on his forgiveness, no deadline, any